For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
So you're aware of the new weekly program that I have started called Ask Nitin, in which I do live viewers engagement on a given topic. This week, I'm going to talk about the Kargil conflict between India and Pakistan in the summer of 1999. How did it start? Why did it start? And what was the outcome, of course, is very well known. But what was the long-term fallout on the dynamic between India and Pakistan is something that we can discuss as we engage on a live program to be recorded every Tuesday at 4 p.m. So take part in the program. Look at the links in the description. Send in your questions and then we'll get back to you whether your question has been selected or not. That is the program Ask Nitin every Saturday at 7 p.m. on StratNews Global.
This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi. Today we're looking at the churn in West Asia and India's interest with our Ambassador Navtej Sarna. He's been India's former ambassador to Israel, to the US and UK. Evening, Ambassador. Good to see you and congratulations on your latest book. I believe it's just climbing up the charts.
Thank you so much, Amitabh.
And also joining us is Ambassador Navdeep Singh Puri. He's been India's ex-envoy to the Suri, I beg your pardon, who's been our ex-envoy to the UAE, to Egypt and to Australia, and is also an author. Ambassador, thank you so much for giving us time.
Pleasure, Amitabh.
Ambassador Suri, just coming to you first, in terms of what's happened over the last few days in the I2U2, as it's called, or West Asia Quad, as some of us like to call it. Two initiatives, there have been some deliverables announced for India, both in the food and the energy sector. Ambassador Suri.
Yeah, when I first heard the formulation I2U2, I thought there's a music group or something that had come up, except that, it was the latest quartet that had emerged on the regional scene. Look, I think it's really interesting that you have a quartet that brings together US, UAE, Israel, and India. And this is only possible because of the opportunities that the Abraham Accords have created, the rapid normalization that we've seen in relations between Israel and the UAE in particular, and that you can have this kind of a grouping. So it came into being when Foreign Minister Jaishankar visited Israel last October. And suddenly, I think at 24 hours notice or something, there was an announcement that the four countries' foreign ministers would be having a virtual meeting. And that kind of kicked up a lot of speculation about what the intent was. I think what this virtual summit that has taken place on the 14th of July during President Biden's visit to Israel has clarified is that as of now, its focus is very much economic rather than strategic or political. And it has identified certain specific areas, 6 to start with. And of those 6, it has chosen 2 to deliver something tangible. And the great news for India is that the 2 tangibles are food security and clean energy. And the projects, these quadrilateral projects in a sense, are both going to be located in India. So it's a perfect situation for us that you have Emirati capital, Israeli and American tech know-how, and the Indian market and requirements of scale that we offer coming together to do something which will benefit the region. If you look at food security, the fact that the Emiratis are putting in $2 billion into an integrated network of food parks, and there is serious talk of an India-UAE food corridor that will enable India to export specific commodities to this region. It's a big deal for countries that are going to be perpetually food dependent, given their climatic and geographic conditions. The clean energy one is particularly interesting because the challenge in renewables has been battery storage. And there's this American company that has apparently developed new technologies and to scale up the battery storage. So if you look at the details, it's a 300 megawatt renewable energy project, a hybrid of wind and solar, but backed up by a 100 megawatt battery storage project. And I think that could really be a game changer, potentially bringing India into the very center of global supply chains that are aimed at perhaps reducing dependence on China as far as renewable energy components are concerned.
Interesting you're bringing up China, though, it's of course in terms of renewables. But as Ambassador Sarna, as Ambassador Suri was pointing out, India would probably not like to call it the West Asia Quad, so that there's no linkage to a military or security dimension. But for at least one of the I's, that is India, and one of the U's, that is US, there is a China dimension in the region.
Well, whether we call it a quad or not, the ground realities remain facts. We are even hesitant to take up security issues in the original quad, because there also, we have a different problem with China than maybe the others. Others also have a problem. And the success of the quad in the Indo-Pacific today, as compared to the first version of quad about 13, 14 years ago, lies in the fact that there's great convergence on China of all four countries. Now, I think we are being very careful in this I2U2, that we are keeping the focus on non-security issues and taking our time relatively, over 6 months to come up with several working groups, go through the projects and keep it very economic oriented and project driven. Because we are aware of the ground beneath our feet. And literally, I think there is the fact that the countries involved in the I2U2 would have a different take on China, not always convergent at the moment. And also, they would have a different take on Iran. So I think these two are the sort of, it's not an appropriate technology, but they're appropriate vocabulary, but they are the kind of landmines in this process. So you'll have to tread carefully, because you can focus on areas which are of common interest, but not go so far as to either invite a question mark from the Iran relationship or for some other countries on the China relationship, and including ourselves, but more so the other two countries, because China has been quite heavily involved in Israel, in UAE. It's a major trade partner of UAE. It's one of the biggest buyers of oil. It's a great exporter to Israel. It's an investor in Israel. So the Chinese must be watching this development with great interest. And, we'll see when they start calling it the Middle East NATO.
You mentioned China, Ambassador, but Iran also, and one of our viewers, Shreyans, is also bringing that up. Will joining I2U to put India in difficult positions with different Gulf countries? How will it affect relations with Iran? We can talk about that later. Ambassador Suri, in particular, if I just break down what Biden, the countries he went to, if I start with Israel. Now, India has this deep, broad and continuously widening relationship with Israel. But, just around the time of the I2U2, there was also news of the Haifa port and the Adani deal. How significant is that, Ambassador Suri?
I think it is important, but don't forget that a mile or two down the road or down the sea,
Absolutely.
the Chinese also have a port. A Shanghai-based entity also has a port there. The Israelis recognize that their ports infrastructure needs to be upgraded, and I think they've decided to bring in private sector. I had seen reports that the Americans were not particularly happy when Chinese were given part of Haifa terminal on a long lease, simply because this is also an entry point for American defense forces. Their Navy ships come there regularly. A bit like Darwin in Australia, where the feeling was that by giving a port on a lease to an entity that is linked with the Chinese Navy, um, are you creating eavesdropping stations or listening posts that will watch on military movements? So, for Adani's to get it, I think it ties up with their global ambitions. At this point, I don't see a particularly strategic aspect to it. Maybe something will emerge as we go forward. But as of now, I mean, I see it as an ambitious move by an ambitious company.
Ambassador Sarna, I mean, Dave has taken the words out of my mouth. He says, this is a question for you. Will the acquisition of the Haifa port give a fillip to the proposed India-Arab Mediterranean corridor?
Well, I think that's a very complicated question, and this is just a first step. I would rather see it as an entry of major Indian companies into infrastructure in Israel. We haven't had such major projects, and the Chinese have been focusing on this. So I would rather see it as that, as the sort of beginning of major Indian investment in Israel in large infrastructural projects.
Sure. Ambassador Suri, the next stop after, I mean, I'll come back to Palestine, but Biden's next stop was in Saudi Arabia. His campaign when he ran for president was to promise to make Saudi Arabia and MBS in particular a pariah. Now with the Russian invasion, it's forced him to change his outlook. Your take on Biden and Saudi Arabia, Ambassador Suri?
But I think, one is when you're campaigning, you can say things that run into the hard reality of governing and, the imperatives of the job that you are holding. But in Biden's case, he complicated his initial remarks about the pariah status by releasing a CIA report which pointed the finger squarely at Crown Prince Sheikh Mohammad bin Salman for the very egregious murder and dismemberment of Khashoggi. So, that was the starting point of a series of misunderstandings, if you would, between the Saudis and the US, bringing it to a point where in March, President Biden was trying to speak with the leaders of Saudi Arabia and UAE, and they were refusing to take his call, something that is quite unprecedented if you go back a few years and look at almost a client-state relationship that the US used to enjoy. So I think Biden was driven by two elements. First, all politics in America, they say, is local. And if gas prices at the pump are $5 a gallon, then that you're going to be losing votes, and you need to be seen to be doing something to calm the oil markets. And the Saudis and the Emiratis are the two countries with the largest spare capacity to pump out more oil and calm down the oil markets. But the second is also to address this perception, which is a very strong perception in the Gulf, that the US is retrenching from the region, and its previous security commitments really don't mean very much, because the Houthis from Yemen and the Iranians through their other proxies have been consistently targeting oil facilities, civilian targets in Saudi Arabia and in UAE in January and in February. And the fact that you have an American naval presence in Bahrain, the fact that you have an American Air Force presence in Qatar, did nothing to deter these attacks. So then the questions come up that what are the US security assurances good for in the region? So I think Biden really had to address that lingering fear. And also, I think the effort was to try and bring these countries on board with whatever happens next on Iran, whether the JCPOA goes through or not. Because in JCPOA 1.0 during Obama administration, the Gulf countries were extremely upset that there was no consultation with them on something that they see as existential from their perspective. And they also felt that the entire focus was of the US administration was on Iran's nuclear program, with no reference to the missiles that threatened them or to the regional interference that Iran was carrying out in Bahrain and in parts of Saudi Arabia and in Lebanon and so on. So I think the Americans needed to have this visit to address some of these concerns. And so let's see whether they actually have achieved something out of this or not.
Ambassador Sarna, Israel is a domestic and international bedrock in America. Do you see any change in policy from the last president and President Biden?
Well, it depends who you ask. But, ultimately, every American president comes to Israel and comes up with a new direction, a new plan. Biden came to Israel, but he really had no plan. And it seemed like he was coming there because of domestic reasons. With the midterms coming up, it's important for him to make the right noises in Israel. He's coming when the Israeli government is entirely lame duck. It's going into its fifth election in 2 years or something, and we don't know who's going to come back. It might well be Netanyahu, and that's why he did spend some time with Netanyahu. And he essentially had no plan to push the Middle East peace process between Israel and Palestine. And he didn't do it. He did pay lip service to the two-state solution. But essentially, the focus in Israel remained Iran. And the Israelis were very keen to get from him a kind of deadline on, how long will you wait for Iran, and a kind of red line that, what will Iran have to do to make you use force? And clearly, he was not willing to give either, and he didn't. He did enter a kind of declaration in which he said that we will not allow a nuclear Iran. But when we pushed to the wall, he did not really answer how long we will wait. He said we won't wait forever. Nobody waits forever for anything anyway. At the same time, he did make a very perfunctory visit to meet Mahmoud Abbas, president of Palestine, and clearly there was disappointment in the sense that despite all statements to the contrary in the campaign, etc., Biden administration has more or less adopted President Trump's policy on most of the issues. They've adopted the Abraham Accords, or the so-called Abraham Accords. They've adopted the fact that the embassy will stay in Jerusalem and no consulate for the Palestinians, no Palestinian offices in Washington, D.C. And the salve here was some economic assistance to the Palestinians. That we will help you set up a 4G in the West Bank and Gaza. We will give money for the East Jerusalem hospital network, which caters to the Palestinians in East Jerusalem and sometimes to people from the West Bank. So there has really been no change of policy on substance from Trump. There is no fresh push for the peace process. And I think, the fact that he came to Israel was more, as Navdeep said, to show that the US is back. And the second thing was to push for regional integration rather than the US doing everything. So if things become easier between the Saudis and Israel, and the US is still part of it, then it's win-win for everybody except the Palestinians. So that's the kind of thing that's been happening.
Ambassador Suri, would you also agree about the Palestinian issue, that it's basically been reduced to just meaningless words or symbolic gestures? And if I can take one question on the subject from Kurt Cobain, who says, since President Biden met the leader of Palestine, what seems to be the future of the question and its implications for India?
Look, I think that the Palestinians are the most undeserving victims of the reality of geopolitics in the region. yes, you could blame them for having missed opportunities that came their way, but in the current status that you have, with every passing year, the reality is that the two-state solution, as Navtej said, gets lip service, but it recedes a bit further into the as a mirage almost. The viability of a two-state solution, the viability of a Palestinian state that is so moth-eaten by these Jewish settlements around the West Bank, I really don't see any realistic way going forward on how those settlements can be rolled back. Which Israeli government will come and roll them back? Which American administration will put enough pressure on Israel to roll them back? I don't see any of that happening. So, even if you empathize with the Palestinians for their plight, there's a reality that is emerging, and Israel, I think, will have to face its own dilemma as it continues on this path of whether it can absorb such a large population, whether it can continue with such a nebulous status quo where you have one set of people denied basic political rights, etc. This old question that will Israel remain a democratic state or will it remain a Jewish state, because it seems difficult to remain both given its current policy matrix. For India, we've often tried to put ourselves in a position where it is not either or. So we maintain good relations with Israel, and we continue to maintain good relations with Palestine. But our capacity to do something substantive for the Palestinians is limited. And I think the question that your participant asked, what are the implications for India? At this point, I don't think Biden's visit to the West Bank has implications for India per se, except, as Navtej said, a reiteration that the peace process is dead right now. There's nothing happening.
Sure. Sarna, you alluded to it, but if you want to just elaborate a little bit more on your thoughts on America, who's been talking a lot, there doesn't seem to be much movement yet, in talking about a West Asia air defense initiative, which is obviously positioned against Iran.
Well, yes. I mean, the deterrence aspect of that is what is important. And the deterrence aspect, I think, was reiterated during the Israeli leg of the visit, which is the right sort of audience for this. And the fact that the JCPOA, it has to be pursued from a position of strength. I think that is what is important for Israel, for US, for the Saudis, and to some extent for the Emiratis. But again, there's a limitation to that. I think the UAE, and Navdeep would know this better, is now planning to send an ambassador to Tehran soon. So, they are going to be playing this a little more carefully. But clearly, there is a kind of face-off happening in the Middle East. You had the Biden visit. Even if you forget the oil factor and his domestic factor, the fact is that there was this common front against Iran, against possible increase in Chinese and Russian influence in the Middle East. And now I think it's tomorrow you have Putin visiting Tehran, where he's also going to meet Erdogan. So you're going to have a mirror image of what happened here. You're going to get, you can invite us back a couple of days later and we'll say the same things from the other side. But that's exactly what's going to be happening there. So you have a face-off between two sets of countries, between two, not allies, but certainly people who would be more comfortable with each other than they are with the other guys. So yes, deterrence, strategic sort of chessboard play is very much happening in Israel, in the Middle East, and the fact that Israel, because of these Abraham Accords, is not somebody alone sitting there with the Americans and facing off everybody else, is a major shift in the last couple of years.
Sure. I just come to that trilateral that you were talking about towards the end of this show. But Ambassador, about India, about navigating between rivals, friends, arch enemies in that region. Iran, how does it fit in, not fit into our interests? We've seen, another attempt at something that kind of fits into the north-south corridor, or variant of it, which was trade from Russia through Iran to India. But your thoughts on Iran, and how does that sit between what else is happening in the region?
Well, let me just take a point that Navtej mentioned, which is
Sure.
Really interesting about the Emirati reaction, because with all of the fire and fury that was coming out of Israel as far as Iran was concerned during President Biden's visit, the Emiratis and the person who made the statement, Dr. Anwar Gargash, the diplomatic advisor to the president, he had to actually step out and clarify that, look, this is not our agenda. We are not in the business of provoking anyone. And if anything, we want to build bridges. And this whole business of weaponry and militarization, we are okay so far as defensive systems are concerned, but we are not in the, don't put us in the same basket as Israel, which is talking about offensive actions. And there's a very pragmatic reason for that. When you look at cities like Dubai and Abu Dhabi, they are just a short stretch of water across from Iranian territory. And within easy striking distance of even short-range missile systems. So the vulnerability of these countries, of UAE in particular, to asymmetric Iranian action is very clear. For us, we've made progress with Chabahar, but I think, frankly, that the north-south corridor, one swallow doesn't make a spring. The fact that a few containers have gone back and forth, at the end of the day, trade is a volumes business. And unless you can ship large amounts of stuff at competitive rates, the chances are that business will keep exploring lower cost options. Right now, you've got a temporary situation because of the conflict in Ukraine and where Russia finds itself. Whether this alters things for good, I don't think so. China's built this railway line notionally to take a container from, they took a train from China all the way to London, right? With great fanfare. But how much trade has actually transited through that route? Nothing. The trade still happens through the sea lanes. So I would simply say that it's nice to be creating some of these alternate pathways to trade. They can be an insurance policy in difficult times, but they really have to prove themselves in the hard word of economics and not just geopolitics.
Sarna, you mentioned that trilateral summit, and I wanted to just delve a little bit deeper. I know we are enlarging the subject a lot, but the area is so complicated and fascinating in a way. This axis, this Russia, Iran, Turkey axis, and the chessboard that you referred to in the area, how do you see that playing out in terms of, say, India's interests?
Well, I think, first of all, you have to see how much it plays out in itself, and before we come to India's interest. I think in itself, the Russia-Iran relationship is fairly easy to understand. They're both been sanctioned heavily by the West, and Iran is in many ways providing an out for Russia from the sanctions. It's going to be one country which can increase its trade. They're talking of increasing their trade tenfold with Russia, and they are supplying them things which they can't get from the West, including, incidentally, there are reports that they're going to supply them drones, but less harmful things like clothes auto parts, etc., are also being talked about and supplied to Russia. And Russian delegations have been visiting Iran over the last few months quite consistently. And this summit that will happen now is kind of it's the sort of the final step. And of course, in terms of Turkey, I think Turkey's position is very interesting. Turkey has been sort of flirting with both Ukraine and Russia ever since the beginning of the conflict. It's condemned Russia. But it's not participated in the sanctions. It's even been supplying drones to Ukraine. But Turkey's got its own angle in it. He'll want a Russian nudge and a wink when they go and hit the Kurds in Syria. So they've got their own angle. But given Erdogan's position vis-a-vis Saudis, given his position vis-a-vis the United States, this is more his sort of comfortable set of friends, let us say. And as far as India is concerned, I think whether they are alone or together, our choices remain pretty clear, and our dilemmas remain the same. Our Iran dilemma vis-a-vis the US and Israel remains the same. Our Russia dilemma vis-a-vis the US remains the same. So we have that tiny space in the middle of all this, in which we will continue to operate on the basis of what is today called strategic autonomy, and putting our interests forward. Of course, it makes things a little more stark when countries sort of get aligned positions, and then if you're not annoying one country, you begin to annoy three countries if you do something like that. So that we'll have to play it as it falls.
Ambassador, your thoughts on this trilateral? Of course, we'll have to wait for any outcomes after that. And what Ambassador Sarna was talking about, I think the NSA, Jake Sullivan, who had leaked out some satellite data to reporters on Russian generals going to an Iranian airbase to ask for hundreds of drones.
I think the progress that Iranians and Turks have made in developing armed drones is really quite something, and it's something that we should in India be watching, that what has enabled them to do this, and there's some lessons in it for us as well. But on Turkey and Iran, these are frenemies at the best of times. There is occasional convergence of interests and much longer areas of competition and conflict that have prevailed through the decades, through the centuries, if you will. The current situation of politics can bring together some interesting bedfellows, but I don't really see anything of a lasting duration. They will try to act together in limited areas where their interests converge. But Turkey itself is an interesting case where, if you look at the last term of President Erdogan, he really had started acting as the new Ottoman Caliph kind of thing, with supersized ambitions and making enemies left, right, and center. He had, Turkey always had good relations with Israel, which were on the verge of rupture. It had certainly a major rupture in its ties with the Gulf countries, even though it had very strong economic linkages with them. And I think it's only the last year and a half or 2 years where the recognition sank in that Turkey's ambition was getting way ahead of its economy. And the fact that the economy was in such a mess, attributable at least in part to some of the woolly-headed economic policies of the Erdogan government, that it's almost been forced to patch up with the Saudis and the Emiratis and others. So, even while you're seeing what's happening with Iran, the fact is that in the last 6 months, Erdogan has visited Riyadh, he has visited Abu Dhabi, and has hosted reciprocal visits. So the normalization and the key takeaway in each of these engagements has been that these countries would invest in Turkey. So again, the fact that the economy is driving some of the shifts that you are seeing. I think the larger picture here is that the fact that the Americans were pulling back or were not as actively engaged, or were saying that there's a pivot to the Indo-Pacific or towards China, means that there was a pressure on these countries to set their own house in order. And what we have seen is that some of the rifts that were very much visible in the last few years, over the last 1 year, there has been a semblance of a patch up. And so it's again part of your title that there's a churn in West Asia where everybody is hedging. The Emiratis are talking to the Iranians and talking about even diplomatic ties with the ambassador being posted. The Saudis are also talking to the Iranians. Iraq, which had been dormant for many years, is trying to deal itself back in the game as the peacemaker between these countries. So there's a lot going on.
A lot going on, and I appreciate you giving us, and that is both the ambassadors, Ambassador Suri and Ambassador Sarna, giving us a lot of your time and sharing your experiences and expertise. Thank you, Ambassador Suri. Thank you, Ambassador Sarna.
Thank you.
And just a reminder that there are links in the YouTube descriptor where you can help support us. And since we were talking about engagement, Nitin Gokhale, our founder and editor-in-chief, has a new show that premiered on Saturday and will play out every Saturday, which has a lot more engagement. Here's Nitin on how you can join.
So you're aware of the new weekly program that I have started called Ask Nitin, in which I do live viewers engagement on a given topic. This week, I'm going to talk about the Kargil conflict between India and Pakistan in the summer of 1999. How did it start? Why did it start? And what was the outcome, of course, is very well known. But what was the long-term fallout on the dynamic between India and Pakistan is something that we can discuss as we engage on a live program to be recorded every Tuesday at 4 p.m. So take part in the program, look at the links in the description, send in your questions, and then we'll get back to you whether your question has been selected or not. That is the program Ask Nitin, every Saturday at 7 p.m. on StratNews Global.